Okay, everyone, thanks for coming. We will start. So there's no mic in this room, but we're being recorded. So I hope it's okay with all of you that you're being recorded. So welcome everyone to Professor Toby seminar on greening the culture and media industries. My name is Audrey Yu. I'm the head of the Department of Communications and New Media and the director of the Cultural Research Center. And the Cultural Research Center this evening is very thrilled to host Professor Miller. Actually, we were hosting him this whole week at NUS. A lot of you have already seen him in the department. So a little bit about the Cultural Research Center. It's an interdisciplinary research incubator. It's housed in the Department of Communications and New Media in NUS. And we host events, we pilot projects, we run workshops, closed workshops, open workshops. So we're kind of a group of multidisciplinary scholars coming together from within the university, within the department, across Singapore and across the Asia, Australia, Pacific region. So we come together to work on projects that are all centered around urban communication and the city. So today, we're as part of all the events that we're doing. We don't do a lot, but we do a few every semester. We're very pleased to have Professor Miller here to present a public seminar. Professor Miller is probably one of the leading thinkers in culture studies today. He's got many titles and many books, so I'll just do a very brief version of that. He is Stuart Hall Professor of Culture Studies at the Metropolitan Autonomous University in Mexico, Research Professor at the University of California, Riverside, and Professor at University, London. And he's the author and editor of more than 40 books. I'll just mention a few. The most recent ones include Greenwashing Culture in 2018, Greenwashing Sport in 2018, The Routledge Companion to Global Cultural Policy in 2018, Global Media Studies in 2016, The Sage Companion to Television Studies in 2015, and The Routledge Companion to Global Culture in 2015. So I've only just kind of rambled off the last 3 years of publication. So here's 2 books in press at the moment coming out. The first one is entitled How Green is Your Cell Phone? And the second one is entitled The Persistence of Violence. And currently he is the president of the Cultural Studies Association of the United States of America. So Professor Miller is visiting CNN as an invited guest of the Cultural Research Center, so please join me to welcome Professor Miller.
Yes, so thanks, Audrey, Professor Yu. It's great to be here. I should say, obviously, I'm speaking in my native tongue of English. I realize for many of you that's also a native tongue, but for some of you it's not. I know what it's like to learn and to teach in another language, so I appreciate this privilege of speaking in mine. And I also want to say that it's exciting to be here at one of the early points in the genesis of this Cultural Research Center. Distinguished department. So there's a small promotional bit about how incredibly important I am. Why are you laughing? And I break copyright all the time, so there are lots of things on my webpage that I wrote but don't own. Apologies to the abogado in the audience. My argument is that this is part of the larger work, that the website is the larger work. So if you're interested in what I have to say, you can steal lots of things without being caught. Not that we do that in Singapore, I understand, from the website. This is the book that's about to come out with one of my co-authors, Rick Maxwell, How Green is Your Smartphone, that Professor Yu mentioned. It's going to be a bestseller, so buy it before it sells out. And this is the book we did a number of years ago called Greening the Media, which is a new, not anymore, 7 years old, but alternative history of all communications technologies from print on, showing that they are purposive contributors to our ecological crisis. All the gizmos you've got, whether it's a pen and a bit of paper in your hand in front of you, or a laptop, or a cell phone, and that I have too, are unsustainable forms of communication. That they are toxic and dangerous for those who manufacture them, sometimes for those who use them, for the environment more generally, and in many cases for those who recycle. This is, I guess, the big point we can make. And we have a monthly column, called Reading the Media. It's in a magazine called Psychology Today. Anybody know Psychology Today? Yeah. So it used to be a very successful newsstand magazine in the United States. Now it's mostly an online thing. It's actually mostly read by US high school students. So it's a very effective way of raising issues that may be of interest to young people about often things to do with media effects or therapy or understanding yourself or neuroscience. And for reasons that I don't understand, they decided to give a column to two kind of crazy socialist white guys. And that's our column, and it's been going for 7 years. We get fantastic attacks by Trumpian climate change deniers who accuse us of trying to destroy the real estate value of their homes and of polluting the minds of the young. Two things I would quite like to do if they were within my power. So, I want to focus in particular today, although the title is the grandiose one of Cultural and Media Industries, on that little cell phone, that little critter there. Because it seems to me that increasingly this is the object of desire and investment when it comes to communications technologies. This is the thing that is meant to incarnate, to embody all that the great warehouse of culture of the past, namely the television, did, plus that of the cinema, plus the newspaper, and so on. Fine, well, no, it's okay. Remember, if you're in the front row, the stand-up guy spits on you accidentally, makes fun of you, makes you feel even less comfortable than you did when you walked in. So, fair warning, okay, guys? So because I think that the cell phone becomes a particularly acute point for talking about these questions, I'm going to focus on that. I thought we could start by things that many of you will know much more about than I do, namely the importance of the smartphone in Singapore. So who doesn't own a smartphone, so-called smartphone here?
Okay.
You tried it, but you got rid of it?
Not in Singapore.
You can't live without one in Singapore. Well, that's clearly what these people say. They're in total agreement with you. So, I like the idea that your social life will be non-existent without a smartphone or tablet. You get very similar numbers in many, many parts of the world, okay? But I wanted to make sure that we had some of the stuff with some so-called hard data, if I can use that slightly unfortunate adjective, that was relevant to here, especially since I'm not an expert and most, if not all of you, are either residents of Singapore or from here in the first instance. And this is a very famous photo of the people on the metro here. And again, you could replicate this in many, many, many cities of the world. It reminds me in the early 80s when I used to think on mass transit that it was unfortunate that people were all wearing walk persons, because I thought this was degrading their ability to form community by chatting to people on buses and trains. And then I remembered I hated it when people started chatting to me on buses and trains. They were creepy old men, and I wanted them to get away from me. Now, of course, I am a creepy old man. So it's even worse for me that there is no way of chatting to these people on buses. This is the fundamental question that I guess Rick Maxwell and I want to pose. And I'm going to come back to this slide at the end. That's the query of this. Because for many of us, the answer to can smartphones be part of a good life ended there is yes. In fact, we've just been told they're essential parts of life at all here in Singapore. So that's a thing to bear in mind, but in the longer question that asks about these other issues as well. And we're attacking this from a different angle from the north. If you look at academic areas like environmental communication, for instance, or environmental humanities, or eco-criticism, or any allied domains, the question that normally comes up is whether journalism or novel writing, or poetry, or television news and current affairs, or long-form or short-form drama, can adequately represent the current state of scientific knowledge about our ecological crisis. Right? This is the task of the media, well or ill, to inform us about the state of the environment. Right? We're saying equally important, if not more so, is the destruction of the environment by these papers. That's the point we're trying to make. That's the provocation. Now I should say, even though there's going to be plenty of time after I rave on at you for questions or comments, please feel free to ask something or offer something while I'm talking. Yeah? Sound okay? And in fact, there will be an opportunity for everybody to participate collectively in a kind of 7th inning stretch later on. So be ready. If you're fallen asleep, I may pick on you, and then all your friends will laugh at you. So, this word green, and this is the totally boring part of the talk. If you think what's happened up to now is dull, the next 5 minutes is terrible. Because it's didactic slides, right? You're probably aware that most of the science on pedagogy tells us very effectively that people don't remember words that they see in slides on screens, despite the fact that your university will tell you that this is an essential part of your learning. It doesn't work, people don't remember it. They remember graphs, they remember interesting images, they remember sounds. They don't remember lots of words, but I've got lots of words to put up for the next couple of minutes, and then we get back to images. So, I lived for many years in LA. I was always horrified by the green lawns in LA. It's silly. It's a desert in which 8 to 10 million people live. It should not have people with lawns like you organically get in Germany or Norway or Britain. That's an absurd use of the word green. And of course it can also mean something that is disgusting. You know, that I turned green because I drank too much or I was sick, or that disgusted me. So it's got lots of interesting connotations in general as a word. Of course, turning green with envy. Hi there, welcome. But sit near the back. No, just kidding. Come wherever. Very welcome to be here. And there are these other new ideas, the new Green Deal that we're hearing a lot about in the United States, but also other countries. And this problematic term greenwashing, Professor Yu was kind enough to mention a couple of books I did last year on this. Does everybody know the word greenwashing, or is it unfamiliar to some of you? Unfamiliar? No, everybody knows it? But you know, it's basically corporations and governments using techniques to appear as though they're ecologically sensitive, when in fact they're not. It's just corporate or state shit, right? If we go back in time, and really the key moment in this is the 1969 oil spill off Santa Barbara in the northern part of Southern California, when the word pollution started being used a lot in the Anglo world and elsewhere, because of the devastating effect on the coastline and on animal and seafood life, or sea life, I should say, not seafood life, since I'm a vegetarian. Sea life of that horror, yes? And similarly, pollution was talked about in terms of runoff from factories. It was talked about in terms of what we now call environmental racism. It was quite clear that lots and lots of effluent from industrialization in the global north was being allowed to fester in areas where minorities and the working class resided. It was quite clear that in many cases, issues like fertility questions for women who might wish to conceive at some point were not being considered in terms of occupational health and safety, a whole raft of issues. But these were understood as essentially local, right? What you needed to do was complain about a corporation and get state action about a river or a lake or a suburb. And this was something that recurred in many parts of the world, but it was local. There was no systemic notion, such as we have today, of global warming, climate change, greenhouse gases, right? This was about specific geography that was being contaminated, and it could be fixed. And it would be fixed once this was all made clear to people, right? So, for example, the Richard Nixon Republican administration in 1970 formed the Environmental Protection Agency. It was bipartisan policy. There was no big split between the Republicans and the Democrats in the US Congress, or there was no cultural politics to any of this. Everyone in agreement, not a big deal. Not a critique of capitalism in any sense, not a critique of growth, a problem with poor husbandry, poor management of local resources, yes? Green came to displace the idea of pollution as something that was about a much broader and more profound commitment to a sustainable ecology of the earth, yeah? That was what really changed, with the realization of all these things as being enormously important, and green became this word for the planetary consciousness. Okay? That was required, or so it was thought at the time. So it becomes what I'm calling here a complex polysemic mélange. I'm rather proud of that. You get tenure and promotion for writing things. Now what's interesting is that it has a whole variety of different meanings that can be invoked by different groups. So whilst you might not find the Republican Party in the United States or climate change deniers invoking it, you get lots of corporations doing so, and you get lots of true conservatives, as opposed to reactionaries, who are very concerned about the cross-generational impact of climate change. So, to give a classic case, if you go back to one of the founders of Western conservative thought, Edmund Burke, in his critique of the French Revolution in the late 18th century, he is the person who invents the phrase, who coins the phrase, what about the lives of those yet to be born? In talking about the need to conserve the earth, something we talk about a lot today, and that people who might otherwise want to cite Burke in terms of his love of the past and tradition versus revolutionary change would be horrifying, unless you were talking about birth control or abortion. But he was not talking about those things. He was talking about those yet to be born as those for whom we have a future responsibility. Yes? And that invocation goes on all the time about my grandchildren, our grandchildren, to which people refer. Right? And of course, in addition to its conservative origins, you also get ecofeminism, post-colonial critiques, anti-capitalist critiques that have picked up on this little syntax of green in order to make points that can connect to compulsory heterosexuality, can connect to hegemonic or hyper-masculinity, all sorts of other elements along with the idea of the degrading of the earth as a consequence of the industrialization that comes with state capitalism of different kinds. All right, so essentially this is saying the same thing. What's interesting, have a look at this little paragraph here. I had a look at what scholars in business and adjunctive fields made of the word green when they used it. And it's astonishing to see how now it can just stand for community, goodness, health, decency, improvement, right? How to get more out of people. It's come to stand for virtually everything that a corporation or a government might want. Look at that little list. My favourite is studying whether plants communicate through music. Does anybody know the answer to this? The answer supposedly is yes. But only green plants. So we've almost finished the words. But what's interesting, if you look at the history of the green political movement, by which I refer specifically to capital G green parties, increasingly they've expanded their remit, just as those corporate and state uses of the term might imply, to include labour, immigration, human rights, degrowth, as it's sometimes called, de-development, as it's sometimes called, climate science, and so on. Because it's become so clear to both scientists and activists that the dimensions and the dementia of our crisis are such that they have impacts on all these questions, both direct and indirect. In short, green has come to stand for the good life. Yes? I think all that's pretty clear. Now, let's bring it down to these babies here, in smartphones. Returning to my suggestion that most work done about the environment and the media, or the environment and communications, is focused on how well or ill environmental science and realities are communicated to people, and how well or ill they understand that communication. Right? Here is an instance, there are a couple of slides, of where the smartphone is seen as a key green tool. Right? API, everybody know what that is? It's basically just how things talk to one another, how systems talk to one another. Here the notion is that the cell phone can become a core element alerting on an early warning basis those within a network to actions that are militating against the environment. Right? Microphones in solar-powered cell phones that pick up the sound of chainsaws. Bang! Sign a petition. Talk to your local deputy, whatever it might be, your congressperson. Right? Software transmits signal to cloud, real-time alert received, immediate intervention. Of course, this means clicking somewhere and being a nice middle-class person, worried about some poor bastard forester just trying to make a living. But nevertheless, right? This is the example of the smartphone working in a market-based way. This is very similar to the World Bank's position on smartphones. It claims that smartphones are extraordinary aids to development, by which it means the way in which economic equilibrium of supply and demand can be established in informal markets where hitherto signals between producers and consumers did not operate adequately, nor did signals between consumers nor signals between producers. Now, if you're in a very complicated jungle area, say, or by a river where there are very few river banks to walk down, you can find out what the price of fish is half a kilometre away when you couldn't before, very easily. And this will apply supposedly both to the fishing folks and to their customers. So this model of instantaneous communication as a means of creating economic equilibrium and capitalist efficiency is very well established in the major international organizations of development, and that's very similar to this sort of sender-message-receiver model of communications that you see embodied here. And then, of course, recycling locations in your pocket. Isn't this a great tool? It means that if you need to get rid of materials that can be recycled and you don't know the area, or your local municipal recycler is no longer operant, you can go to your smartphone, it'll tell you, well, honey, just go here and get rid of the trash or whatever it is, and that'll be fine, right? So this all looks pretty good from that very standard, very orthodox notion of environment and communication. All right, moving away from that for a moment to look at cell phone expansion. Now, rather like the chart that talked about uses of the cell phone in Singapore, this will not be news to you. But it does show you how things have really changed. Anybody here have any interest in the English Premier League? Probably not, a little bit, not much. Anyway, this is to show how different clubs that have won that league correlate with the emergence of very different kinds of cell phones. Right? Poor old Tottenham won the league in 1960 when Prince, Madonna and Michael Jackson and I were all 2. And that was the smartphone du jour. And this has become a very famous instance of how in different parts of Asia the smartphone is ubiquitous. This is a Singapore-centric chart that I love about smartphone use. Of course, it has to leave out Korea and distort the US figures completely, but Singapore's number 1, damn it. Just get out of the way, don't you understand anything? So I love this kind of chart, I'm all in favour of it. There should be a lot more made of it. As I say, South Korea wipes everybody else off the map. The best way in that case is just to keep them off the map themselves. Right? You're all familiar with the way the iPhone took off spectacularly. A lot of that because of a big spike in Europe and Japan and the US, and then latterly in China. But the numbers in China have dropped off considerably in the period since. the major international organization that is in charge of telephony and most broadcast communications frequencies on a global basis, the International Telecommunications Union, says the following, and of course there are all these base stations as a consequence. Right? So more people are now using smartphones than is the case of the number of people who are dead in the entirety of history in much of the world. It's that kind of number. One of the issues, of course, is that in many parts of Africa, the ITU, other international organizations, corporations and NGOs and non-government organizations are trying to spread the cell phone with the same logic that I mentioned in terms of the equilibration of markets, as per the example of the river, prior to, as a priority over possible water. So in many parts of Africa, more people have smartphones than have drinkable water. And this is regarded as a triumph by many in the industry. Another point, this is that South Korea comes roaring back into the picture despite Singapore's attempt to push it off the map. The point is, this stuff is everywhere, right? You know that already. How many times do you touch your cell phone each day? Remember that unless you've lived in Rwanda, you probably touch your face several hundred times a day. You can tell doctors and nurses who've worked in Rwanda they don't nearly touch their faces, whereas you do it lots of times. You'll do it tonight. I've done it already several times. The average in the United States is estimated at 2,617 times a day touching the cell phone. Now, I love this. I find this literally inconceivable. I can imagine 500, right? Because you've got to send WhatsApp saying, I'm at the bus stop. Are you at the library? I'm at the station. Do you think that guy was cute? No, he was ugly. He was stupid. He was an asshole. So I get that this requires a lot of touching, right? As a consequence of the lack of community that I was claiming we now suffer in mass transit as a consequence of these gizmos. Nevertheless, look at that. It's incredible. It's obvious these things are very much part of our quotidian reality. This is maybe not so easy to say. Nielsen, which as many of you, if not all, will know, is the biggest ratings company in the United States, one of the biggest in the world, now is very keen at looking at ratings in a different way from before, so it's prepared to look at different machinery and different timing for consuming the same sports event, reality TV show, whatever it might be, right? Experience of a commercial message. And this is showing you how app web on a smartphone is this color here. It's taking up quite a bit of time, and then when you add that app web on a tablet, you can see that these devices are taking up more and more time. Rather romantic language to call this smartphone addiction, but in terms of hours per day spent online via a mobile device, it is quite clear that in the 4 years between 2012 and 2016, there is a spectacular surge in many countries, most notably, obviously, Brazil, but in others too. Most of these, of course, are wealthy countries, with the one exception of Brazil and, of course, much of China. So, how do we make sense of all of this now that I've established things that I think are pretty obvious anyway to most of you? How pollution gave way to green, how cell phones have become ubiquitous in many parts of the world. Given that I'm saying I think there's a major problem that is caused by the intersection of media and cultural technologies with the environment, how do I prove that and what do we do about it? Well, the way I think we need to think about it is through the notion of the life of the commodity sign, an idea that I mentioned to a few of you the other night. So I apologize that one or two of you will be seeing some slides you've already labeled through. And that is to say, if we can understand the environmental impact of all the things that come to the making of this clicker, be they mineral, animal, human, gaseous, that take place while I'm using it, that take place after I'm using it, in terms of its recycling, then we're in a good position to see how green these commodities are and potentially to take action to make them ecologically more viable. Does that make sense? So instead of talking, as people endlessly do, about how long someone spends on the phone, what uses they make of it, whether they are addicted. So DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, which determines whether or not you're mad almost anywhere in the world. It has some cross-cultural manifestations that modify it, but basically it's the tool used. It includes internet addiction and smartphone addiction in the forthcoming edition. The British Post Office invented the idea of being unable to cope without a phone, which has become a really big issue. There are endless studies now of freshman students who have what is called phantom vibrating phone syndrome. Anybody suffer from this? Right, so you're sitting in a lecture, you think your phone is vibrating, there's a message and you must answer it, it's not vibrating. Thousands of poor young American unsuspecting undergrads have been diagnosed with this appalling malady. All of that is very interesting, but maybe not as important, or should be put alongside the importance of ecological impacts you can get from the life of the commodity side, although the impact on the body of the user is also something I want to talk about. Now, I realise you can't read all of this from where you are, but I'm sure the Cultural Research Centre will happily make this available to anybody who maybe talks to one of us afterwards, if you want these slides sent to you. But this is this model of a that I didn't make up actually, but the idea of the life cycle of a cell phone, starting at the top with materials extraction, moving on to processing, to manufacturing, to packaging and transportation, to useful life, to end of life, to disposal. If we thought about all the media industries in that light, instead of what does this film mean, or why did sound come to Hollywood, or any of the other questions that we come up with, if we could add to those this approach, I think we'd be doing something much more interesting than is the case now. Now this is a cheap misogynistic shot of a slide, although those of you who are not very keen on the Netherlands might be very happy to see the Dutch represented in this way. And it's clearly a sort of avatar figure, but it raises an interesting question, okay, from a global north perspective. And my experience in talking about this for the last 15 years before there were smartphones in many parts of the world is that people have this kind of response, although, as I say, it's probably represented in a rather egregious manner for this poor young woman. You all remember your periodic table. The bits in red are the things that are in your cell phone. Okay? Astonishing amounts of materials, some of which are in raw form very dangerous, some of which are not. And who produced this? Nokia produced this table. As they became less and less successful and important, they revealed more and more about what they really did. This is why I now tell everybody how to become a full professor all over the world. As my career is in tatters, I disclose the truth, following the Nokia model. So where does this stuff come from? Many of you will be familiar with the concept of conflict minerals, right? Sometimes applied to things like diamonds, but often applied also to the core elements of all central processing units, as required for all the technological devices that we've mentioned tonight. A lot of this is only available in the Great Lakes of Africa, particularly the Democratic Republic of the Congo. As you're no doubt aware, maybe 5 million people have died in the civil war in Congo. Hundreds of thousands have been enslaved. Millions of women and children have been raped, all funded by that and this and all these toys. Because the militia and the state make their money by enslaving people who remove under unsafe conditions from makeshift mines these products and then sell them to Indian and Chinese smelting companies who take them offshore, smelt them and move on. And it's that mining and manufacturing element that I want to draw your attention to. Okay? Now, it is very possible to criticize, again, this sort of slide as a sort of poverty porn slide, as it's sometimes known. Okay? If we had more time, I could play you lots of very powerful, very meaningful documentaries when children aged 5, 7, 8, with cancers all over their bodies, who do this mining, speak to camera, who have names, who have stories, and explain what's happening to them. And also very brave, similarly brave, undercover journalists working with them. These are the conditions under which people operate. Technically not slaves, they're making maybe 2 cents a week. Okay? Absolutely no protection in terms of the materials they're exposed to. Then, of course, once the smelting has been done by these Chinese and Indian firms, we move on to manufacturing. This is a story more of you will be familiar with because it got huge exposure in the Western press and drew responses from major companies like Samsung and Apple, namely the suicide levels of young people working in the factories that manufacture these goods. Now, even though, if you look at the data, the percentage of people suiciding was not spectacularly high given the number of people working, the fact is, some who died and some who survived left messages, wrote poetry in 1 or 2 very powerful moving cases, describing their sense of total anonymity, what they had to do. So I tried to get into one of these factories a few years ago in southeastern China. We were held back at gunpoint. We did manage to talk to some of the young women who had mostly come from the north, from villages without a great deal of money, who'd come south in order to be able to send remittances back to their older parents and maybe for use by younger siblings. They were required to live where they worked. They were required to work 7 days a week. They were not allowed out of the compounds other than on a Sunday afternoon. And they'd been separated from the other young women they'd come from the same village with in order to prevent a form of solidarity emerging. The only way they could meet those other young women was on this Sunday afternoon, which was where we met them. Now, there are lots and lots and lots of, in many cases Hong Kong-based, in many cases Christian organizations that send in undercover people who can pass, who work in these factories, take photos, take movies, share stories, bring them out. Ironically, the biggest firm, one of the biggest private sector employers in the world is Foxconn, which is a Taiwan-based company run by a former high-ranking Taiwan military man who is standing for the Taiwanese presidency this year, based on a dragon that came to him in a dream and told him to improve relations between the PRC and Taiwan. This is his campaign message. And the PRC laps him up. But he has had a lot, and so has his company, had a lot of critique because of these Hong Kong activists and even very reactionary news organisations like Sky in the UK, the Daily Telegraph, that have covered these stories. And what's happened is that what are called originary equipment manufacturers, do you know this expression, OEM, originary equipment manufacturers, are being held to account. Because what Apple and Samsung and Lenovo and all these monsters do is to argue that, well, it has nothing to do with us. We didn't make that thing, we designed it. If you look at Apple's Internal Revenue Service tax return, do you know what it says it does?
Design.
Thank you. Do you know what Nike says it does? It's a designer. It doesn't make shoes, and Apple doesn't make computers. It's a designer. So it has these subcontractors whom it would love to be able to control, but hey, we just pay them for their work. We don't own them. Now, because the outrage at these suicides was so intense, Apple, like Nike 15 years earlier, has had to change its way of operating. And so if you go to the Apple website now, you'll find Tim Cook proudly showing photos of his visits to these factories. He wears a nice little hairnet, fetching, and assures us that salary or wage rates have gone up, industrial protections are better, unions are now encouraged, and all this other gumph, right? There are now ping pong ball tables where they can play. It's just damn. So this idea of trying to bring home to these original equipment manufacturers that they are not just designers, but they have responsibility, has had some effect. Foxconn has had a terrible reputation as a consequence and is revising some of the things it does, but there are still people going underground to report back to Hong Kong, to the United States, to Western Europe in particular, about these issues. Here are some of the nets that have been put in place to catch people as they try to kill themselves. And this is boasted about by Foxconn. Look how wonderful we are. We have suicide nets. So, at the point of mineral extraction and at the point of manufacturing, there are major impacts on our environment. In particular, the lives of human beings, who are also part of our environment, along with the things that we read about when we think about climate change. And then the next issue is, what about us as users, those of us who have these phones in our pocketbooks, next to our lungs, next to our heads when we're sleeping? What about that? Well, this is where there are all kinds of issues that the cell phone industry raises, some of which you may be familiar with. So one of the risks is a malicious URL, on-device malware, a network attacker, all the rest of it, right? So the risks to you as a networked person are loss of your integrity, your security, your privacy. You know that when you're watching porn, your camera's been invaded, and so you're being watched while you're watching. It's a classic example. Turns some people on, probably, but many people worry about. Here's another summary, a very good one. Problem at work, the boss is seeing that instead of reading Professor Yu's latest book, instead you're watching, the NFL. Right, you've been found out. Eye disease, neck text, we're going to get onto that. Anybody here suffer from neck text? It's my favourite new disorder. You have it? But only since moving to Singapore. In other places, the neck is just fine. But I can see sort of
No, it's because of the
massaging.
not a smartphone, but
Yeah. Threats, security risks, risks from posting. Smartphone syndrome is another good one. This is a sign from Stockholm that I really love. Wonderful. I think we need more of these signs. Maybe Prof in US could start putting some of these up. Stockholm. Anybody been to Stockholm? It's a fantastic city. It's impossible to believe anywhere could be so clean. And so few people wandering around bumping one another. And this is it. Anterior head syndrome, which is what this gentleman is experiencing. Which is people texting so much that their necks get stuck. Right? Tension, headache, neck and shoulder pain, difficulty breathing, pain in the middle of the back, chest, lower back. Oh my God, I've got to stop. And then this is a big thing that's emerging here in Southeast Asia, prevalence of myopia among 20-year-olds. Anybody here 20, more or less 20? Danger. You're about to lose your sight. Be very, very careful. But this is a genuinely fascinating chart. Here are myopia levels in the 30s through to today. Now clearly, the prevalence of testing and the quality of testing are both going to have increased monumentally over that period. But arguably not all that much from, say, the late 70s, particularly in what were already relatively wealthy places like these countries. And the argument is made that this is about use of cell phones from a young age, holding the glass too close to the eyes. This is an argument. I'm not endorsing it, I'm not saying it's true, but it's a correlation that people here in this region are making. Then there is the business of driving. The data on the number of accidents that are caused by people driving while using their cell phones is utterly scarified, right? Hands-free dialing doesn't help. Anybody here guilty of doing this? Don't answer that question. This is my favourite one. Have any of you seen this slide before? Don't use the cell phone on the toilet in Singapore. Understood? Very good. we can move on.
Is that because the smartphone will be damaged, not because then you will suffer any kind of damage?
It is about what will happen to the smartphone.
So they're really looking out for the smartphone.
They are looking out for the smartphone. Absolutely.
Priorities in this country.
Well,
And of course-
indirectly they're looking out for you, because let's say the smartphone is damaged because it is now almost necessary to have a smartphone in your head. Then you would have to buy another smartphone.
Yes.
And then if it's re-damaged, you have to buy another smartphone.
It's called stimulating the economy.
So you're leaving a
Well,
trail.
now you're going to be contributing more to the economy than somebody else.
You're leaving a trail of smartphones across public lavatories, right over the island. The other thing is, of course, it's very important not to go away. Never leave Singapore, because 1 in 5 cell phones will be destroyed on vacation. But the worst places work. So, I absolutely adore this. I love the look on this guy's face. Is he meant to be relaxed? He's definitely lost his cell phone. Huh? So, here is the 7th inning stretch show and tell. If you've got a smartphone and you're prepared to participate, don't worry, I will not call you up by name or anything like that. Can you take it out now, please?
Already out.
Already there. Fantastic. So, depending on the brand you have and depending on the regulatory system that prevails in the place where you have your smartphone, some of these things may be slightly different. Is there a thing called something like configuration? You know, like settings? Could be settings? Yeah. Okay, so settings, a word like that as one of the icons on the front. And then under settings, something like general. Yes? Did you find that? And then something like information. Or about, yes. And then something called legal advice.
Oh yeah, legal.
Yeah.
I found the smart
Yeah.
assistants.
Pardon?
I found the smart assistants.
Smartest, okay, all right. Something like legal advice, and then it tells you how you're going to get cancer and be killed.
RF exposure.
RF exposure. Now, compare this to a packet of cigarettes, where there are pictures of dying lungs and diseased hearts all over the cigarette packet. Here, how far do you have to go into the system to find out that these babies are going to kill you?
I still don't see it.
Ah, well, it's even better disguised. Some regulatory places don't do it.
Mine's a China phone, so they don't tell me.
They don't tell
They
you.
just kill me.
They just kill you. So, question:
Use advanced.
How many of you have gotten to this before?
Yeah.
Most people have never seen it. Now, I am not telling you that you are actually going to die as a consequence of using your cell phone, but you might. In other words, the science is absolutely ambiguous and ambivalent about this. But it is utterly shocking that this is not on the front of your cell phone. But you have to go this far into the system, and why would you bother to learn this? Okay? Now I know this is like the headline, 7th inning stretch, wake up, big time, but truly, the jury is out. It's just that there is a jury that is out. You see what I'm saying? So, last year the US National Toxicology Program looks, you've got to look at male rats. No knowledge of anybody's body, especially women's, is complete without looking at a male rat. We know this, right? All these studies are done on male rats because, hey, they're out there. There appear to be connections between the development of cancers and cell phone exposure. This research by hundreds of people working in the program went out for validation, cross-checking, replication all over the world. Another independent study, not of the same dimensions but pretty big, by the Ramazzini Institute in Italy, came out with the same results. If you go to the Straits Times or the New York Times or the Guardian and you key in cell phone safety cancer, they'll tell you that there are mad bastards around the world lying to you, telling you there is danger when really there isn't. So we had to fight to get these scientific findings even discussed in How Green Is Your Smartphone. Really fight. So strong is the campaign and so well funded to claim there is no possibility of any problem. All we're trying to say, and all they're trying to say, is male rats get cancer. let's think about it. Yes? And if there's no problem, why do these companies put this in your phone at all? Right? And by the way, is everybody excited about 5G? Don't be. 5G requires antennae sending out these frequencies to be posted absolutely everywhere. Because unlike 4G, 3G, 2G, and 1G, you can't just have a base system every kilometre or 5 kilometres. You've got to have one every couple of hundred metres, or it doesn't work. Okay? So, theoretically, it's non-ionising radiation, this RFR, and it won't cause cancer. That is the null hypothesis. And this null hypothesis is held to as an absolute truth by almost the entire English language bourgeois media and by many governments, but not by all, not by the French government, but you know, they're surrender pansies. We know this from the Iraq War, right? And they have all these funny cheeses and whatnot. We don't pay attention. It's French. Nor the Italian government, nor the European Union, nor in fact your cell phone manufacturer in most cases, nor in fact your communications regulator in most cases. So the null hypothesis is being questioned. It doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong, but it could be wrong. Yes? That's the only point I'm trying to make. So this is the big issue. But it's not just about what the cell phone companies used to say, which is don't hold the phone next to your head. That's why Ted Kennedy and John McCain died, because they got overheated brains. Right? The claim that these companies make is that it's a heat problem, that their heat shields are now better, as long as you never speak into the phone like this, and you always wear, you know, non-Wi-Fi headphones in order to talk to people, you're safe. That could be true. But that's the only thing they'll admit to, the danger of heat from the radiation causing you to develop malignancies. So, this is a big issue. It is not specifically about climate change, causation, greenhouse gases, and so on. It again is about harm to the ecology of the planet in the shape of human beings. Here are some of the possible connections.
Got about 12 of those already.
I know, yeah, I know. In fact, I'm off the chart. I have many more than this. I'd like to be able to blame them on the smartphone. I mean, who isn't dizzy? Don't you feel dizzy when you're sitting down? But if you stood up, didn't you feel dizzy? You would, even without your smartphone. And there's your head. That's a male rat's head. So, nowadays, you can find out which cell phones emit the least radiation. Do you feel better after looking at this chart based on your own consuming practices? This is least, not most. So, the funky Koreans and the funky Chinese, Motorola now owned by Lenovo, right, are not so bad. Samsung not so bad. And then most radiation. You were asking about the iPhone. This is the iPhone 7. It's up there. I don't even know what this is. It Xiaomi? Does anybody know? Is it, how do you say it? Xiaomi. Xiaomi. Apologies for pronunciation. Where's that from? China. Stranger danger. Look after stay away, or you'll get worse than, you know, Texter's neck coming your way. Maybe, maybe not. iPhone 8, not as intense as iPhone 7. Anyway, like I said, you can get these slides later if you want. So now, what about this? Now that we've determined that they're destroying the lives of the people who dig up the minerals for them, destroying the lives of the people who make them, and destroying the lives of those who use them. So thank God for smartphones, because they're saving the environment. Established at the beginning. What about their direct environmental impact? This is a really complicated one. So for example, the more complex the technological device in terms of its electronics, the greater environmental impact at the point of production. But cell phones, which are some of the most complex there are, then actually often use somewhat less energy and have a less deleterious impact on the environment than others. So for instance, if you are watching a football game on a cell phone and it's through Wi-Fi and not 4G, then the environmental impact is arguably somewhat less than if you're watching it on television. But if you're all watching the same event at the same time, is there some big event in Singapore, sports event or around the world that everybody watches? Like the Super Bowl or World Cup final?
National Day.
National Day. So you're watching the same event at the same time. And there's got to be a break in it. When there's a break in it, your electricity systems are going to go to the dirtiest system possible because you're all going to go to the refrigerator and open the door and get something out. You're all going to turn on a kettle and you're all going to flush a toilet. This is what is called the energy spike, and any regulator has to allow for about 25 times the biggest payload you could ever otherwise expect at halftime in a match or at some other break in a big event. Because all those people do all those things all at the same time, and solar power and battery and hydropower are never going to have enough backup to cope with, not so much in Singapore's case, but in the case of much larger populations, tens of millions of people using massive amounts of energy all at the same time. Okay? So this is part of what comes from the spectacle effect of watching these events on all electronic gizmos. And then there's the lifetime issue, which I'm going to get onto in a moment, and this word e-waste, which many of you will be familiar with. In Western Europe, it's called waste of electronic and electrical emissions. A very spectacular example of cell phones thrown away. They're supposed to last about 4.5 years. The average around the world is less than 2 years. People keep them. Now, you could argue this is built-in obsolescence, an old capitalist tactic, make the thing fall apart before it needs to, so that you'll have to replace it. But in fact, people love replacing these things. They replace them when they don't need to. When they don't need to because of a software update. When they don't need to because supposedly there's some fantastic new app they don't have enough space for. Right? Constant replacement, kind of triumphant. Look at me, I've got the new thing. I, of course, bought the iPhone 10 the day before the 11 came out. I feel terrible about it. You know, because I live in Mexico, I figured it'll take a while for the 11 to get there, but of course, a lot of them are made in Mexico. This is, I think, one of the very powerful, and there are many artistic representations of this issue. Very telling, at least to me. E-waste totals, world totals, per inhabitant down here, world totals at the top. What I'm interested in more is how this happens and where it goes. So, do any of you remember when your families threw out their old fat screen analogic TV sets and got the slim, slender, gorgeous, cute, girlish figure digital ones? Where did your fat screen TV go? To the footpath. Yes, to the footpath.
Was the informal recycling.
Informal recycling. The crazy grandparent. The mad uncle might have got it. Anybody else? Most of us don't know where they went. And if it went to the curb, it probably was picked up by a municipal body that then went to an informal recycler pretending to be operating in the formal sector, who then didn't recycle it safely. This is what happens again and again and again. Even in places that have pretty good laws about this, enforcement is terrible. The Canadian government, run by that nice man who likes to put on makeup, it lists e-waste trade as the 8th biggest element of organised crime internationally. It's astonishing. So it's up there with sex trafficking, other forms of slavery, and illegal drugs, because it's illegal to export this stuff almost everywhere in the world. So, who generates the most electronic waste? This is not per capita, this is total. No surprise that China's way ahead of anybody, and that the US is second, and not that far behind, and that they dwarf everywhere else, right? These are countries with utterly reprehensible ecological immediate past and presence, and in the case of the United States, an utterly reprehensible long-standing past. Yes? Astonishing numbers, and per capita, clearly China is nowhere near as responsible as Germany or France or Italy. But now let's do the per capita stuff, and it's those nice social democrats in the Nordic countries. They're all monsters.
But which one matters more? Which one here would matter more?
Which would matter more? Well, that's an interesting question. If you're looking at it from a sort of philosophical, ethical point of view, then a lot of people would place more attention on the per capita. But if you're talking about the overall ecological impact, of course it's that. It's the totality. And especially as we would imagine, China will continue to take off and go ahead, and India will take off massively. And this becomes a very complex, sorry, just 1 second, come to you. Very complex issue when, for instance, as I say, I talk about this, like Leonardo DiCaprio, I fly around the world in order to save it, right? When you raise these issues, lots of people in the global south say, well, it's not you in particular, people like you who've had this development for centuries and benefited from it. And now you're wagging a finger at everybody else and telling us not to do it. To which the only answer can be, you're right, and there should be compensation paid by the global north because of this. But we simply cannot afford to get moralistic about it in terms of the nature of the crisis. You know what I mean? So that's where I think you have to bring together the per capita stuff with the totality stuff. And the per capita stuff relates so clearly to the privilege of the global north in the past and the present. Yeah?
I was going to say, if you look at global, if someone were to compare that, it might create a lazy attitude like, oh, we're not contributing so much to the global, so I'm not going to worry about it as much. But then, if you look at per capita, that's where the attitude negatively affects you. So now, you're not worried about it because your global contribution is so low that you don't care. And so then it increases individually.
And what's interesting, of course, is that places like Sweden, which have quite a high e-waste issue, actually have an almost zero contribution ultimately to greenhouse gases from their electronic waste, because they have a total recycling model that works extremely effectively. So, in a sense, this chart and the previous one need to look at how these numbers are treated. You know, what happens next. This is not a terribly clear picture, and one of the difficulties is this is 2014. Most of the charts are from earlier. The issue is that until recently, the entire direction of flow of e-waste was from the global north to the global south, particularly West Africa, India, and China. Nowadays, of course, the biggest flows are coming not only from the United States, Japan, and Western Europe, they're coming from within China and also within India. And they're going to Malaysia in terms of local places. Hong Kong is the biggest entrepot for this illegal trade. And they're also being dumped in much of South America. I mean, this lists Venezuela and Paraguay and Mexico, but actually Brazil gets a lot. Now, one of the fascinating things about this is that if you look at it in scholarly terms, you will find almost nobody in communications, media, or cultural studies writing about this. There are a few people, but very few. If you look at environmental science, if you look at epidemiology, at occupational health and safety, at chemistry, a lot is written about it. Almost nothing from Japan, the United States, or Western Europe. The scholars who write about this are from and based in Nigeria, Ghana, Brazil, India, China. So there is an opportunity here for the traditionally unequal flow of information, where the global south is the object but not the subject of knowledge, to be switched, because so much of the interesting research I would say there is probably a flow of 4 or 5 academic articles per week coming from various parts of the global south on these topics, right? That can challenge the norm that, theoretical ideas, political ideas, scientific ideas originate somewhere else and have been applied in these nations. It's quite the opposite when it comes to both the geopolitics of e-waste flow, but also the science of what electronic waste does to the air, the earth, water, and people. Oh, whoops, sorry. So this is giving you a rough idea, I know it won't all be legible where you're sitting, as to which bits of our cell phones are easily recycled versus not so easily. The stuff in green shows an over 50% recycling rate. The stuff in red shows less than 1% recycling. Now, I'm just trying to give you a general impression, rather than to worry too much about the details, that there is a huge variety of recycling proclivity, and it depends a lot on which bits you're talking about. So rare earth metals in particular, very rarely recycled. If we were talking about televisions, these are the hardest items to recycle of all manufacturers. It's easier to manufacture a small ship than a TV, to recycle a small ship than a TV set. Is this something you learn in TV studies? I don't think so. Is this something you learn about when you learn about the new media? I don't think so, generally. Maybe in Singapore it's different. But my experience, many parts of the world, not on the agenda. Not talked about at conferences, not in articles, not in books, not on syllabi. Why not? No good reason. So, this is an indication of different ways in which recycling can take place. This is the informal sector, where you see vast numbers of particularly young women who could be aged from, say, 6 or 7 up, picking away at central processing units in search of gold or some other alloy that can then be resold. Horrendous effects on cerebral development and all kinds of other health impacts. This is an example of a very effective mechanical form of recycling. And this is an example of the kind of object that people are working with. Here are, again, we can criticize this as poverty porn, but I'm trying to have that shock, visceral impact for people. Different parts of the world where most of this goes on. So I'm about to give you the name of somebody who, if you Google him, you will read about him inserting diodes into his anus. Okay? This is one of those trigger warnings that professors are supposed to give. Okay? But a friend of mine who is a queer performance artist, Danny Plöcher, goes into e-waste dumps and lives and works as an e-waste worker for weeks at a time. I've taken photos of the infections all over his arms and hands that he gets every time from being in these places. And when he goes back to these places, the young men, in these dumps it's mostly young men, are no longer there, they're dead. Or they're completely incapacitated from various cancers. The particular area he works in is Nigeria. Okay? So this is serious stuff in terms of the impact it's having on these lives. But at the same time, the parts that can't be easily recycled are burnt, in which case they're destructive to the air, they're buried, in which case they're destructive to the earth, the soil, or they're thrown into water, in which case they're destructive of that. But NUS is on the case, damn it. This is cultural studies, so we have to have a positive spin at the end, right? Isn't that right, Prof? We have to leave with full of resources of hope. It is not just pessimistic, appalling, Marxist political economy. Don't worry. Together we can make it all better. We're Boy Scouts and Girl Guides. Oh, damn it, we're in this. So, actually, in all seriousness, this is research going on here, though I don't know the people who are doing it, that is not going down the route that's been very successful, but is extremely costly, of safe industrial regime, physical processing through machinery of different forms of e-waste in order to look for what can be recycled. This is instead a synthetic biological method, which supposedly, if it's fully synthesized, will be relatively cheap. The problem is, when are things cheaper than if you can get them done by a 5-year-old girl? En masse. But this is going on right here. And of course, because this is cultural studies, the people will rise as one and we'll fix it ourselves, even if the scientists at NUS don't manage. So we've got the other story of hope, which to conclude, which is activism. I've already mentioned some of the Christian groups in Hong Kong and other Hong Kong groups that are very much involved in sending in, not agent provocateur, but participant observers to see what's going on and to come back. There are other groups, so No More I Slave, which is associated with Jack Chu. Some of you will know Jack from, he's been here to speak, right? From the Chinese University of Hong Kong, who's a mainlander, very much from the working class originally, and who has written a wonderful book, No More I Slave, as part of the organisation efforts to ensure that workers in the factories in China in particular, who are building these objects, have their message heard and also manage to connect with others in other parts of the world. You know, one of the things I work on is television set manufacture. All televisions are made in 3 countries. Mexico, normally #1, China and Vietnam duking it out for numbers 2 and 3. They each make over 30% of the world's TV sets. Appalling working conditions, terrible impact on the bodies of mostly women who assemble these things. Again, big fertility issues, recognising not all people want to be fertile, in inverted commas, but you know what I'm talking about. No toilet breaks, sexual harassment on the job, all those issues go on hugely. So it's not just a China thing, but No More I Slave is a big movement. The Make IT Fair one, Good Electronics and the China Labour Bulletin, both worth connecting with. China Labour Watch, which is actually based in New York, that has Chinese activists running it, very good. Up there, SVTC, the Silicon Valley Toxics Coalition, incredibly important. SACOM, which is the Hong Kong-based scholars and activists against corporate malfeasance, very important. I'm sure you could name plenty of others. This is not a case of Western do-gooders complaining about the lives of others, in any sense. Now, what can activists do? One thing is to ask, what makes the iPhone so smart? Not just the iPhone, but other smartphones. So to go back, following this life of the commodity sign, back, as they say in baseball commentary, even back beyond the foraging for minerals in mines, and into the very design of the componentry. Many of us would probably say, well, Steve Jobs invented the iPhone, or Apple invented the iPhone. No. US-based academics in science departments funded by the Pentagon invented everything in the iPhone, apart from some bits that were invented by CERN in Western Europe. This is military money. This is how the internet was invented too, as I was saying to some of you the other night. Military money from the Pentagon going to scholars who invent everything, and then it gets handed over to capitalism for free. This is how US capitalism works. That's how the entire airline industry works. It's the basis of what was Cold War scholarship throughout the period from the 50s on until '89. Everyone thought things would change. There'd be what was called a peace dividend, and scholarship would move away from servicing the Pentagon. The Pentagon, much too smart to allow that to happen. Not only the Pentagon, the CIA as well. So just look at DARPA. DARPA is the dirty tricks element of the Pentagon. So it's psychological manipulation, it's interrogation, it's torture. They fund computer scientists with double the funding they'd ever get on a postdoc anywhere in the world to be involved in creating interfaces that are useful for the military. And then they hand them over to, in this case, Apple. You can go up and down, Department of Energy, CIA, Department of Defense, the Navy, the Army Research Office, you name it. Right? This comes from Mariano Mazzucato, who is an Italian economic sociologist. And you can imagine the reaction of sort of true-believing US capitalists to this information. Yes, sir.
Just to point out, the same issues were there when these technologies were being developed. If you read any history of Silicon Valley and they were local to the United States, but pretty much the same issues.
Oh,
They just
absolutely.
blown up and.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the internet was devised to be based on the system of freeways across the United States. The packet system was created so that if intercontinental ballistic missiles from the USSR hit DC or hit New York, they would not take out communications, right? The packet system, you know when you send an email, it doesn't get to where it's supposed to go and it comes back to you and you get 20 lines of code, that's the packet system being made visible to you. That's built into the system in order to avoid the possibility of being destroyed by one attack. Another example of handing over the internet. The US Pentagon, the military, offered the internet to AT&T for $1 million in 1970, the whole thing. They didn't think it would ever work, so they didn't accept it. This is one of the combined campaigns of Good Electronics, which I think is Dutch-based, and made by CT Fair. Stop Poisonous Industry. And this again is thinking about the effects on workers. Greenpeace, lovely, cuddly, multinational NGO, brings out ratings of smartphones in terms of their environmental impact during production. Obviously an F is bad and a B is the best. Have any of you got a Fairphone? I don't think they work here. Have any of you heard of Fairphones? I'm going to go on to them with a little promotional moment in a second, but I have no financial interest in them. Renewable energy uses, very bad. Report cards for these two guys. This is Fairphone. So Fairphone, at the end of August, released Fairphone 3. Fairphones 1 and 2 were fairly successful. This is the story of contemporary capitalism. They had 5 employees. They were unable to scale up, rather than this appalling use of language, in order to make money. So for Fairphone 3, they have 65 employees, 60 of whom are marketers. Whereas in the beginning, 5 of them, they had one who ran the thing, 1 who did labor relations, and 3 who designed the phone. Now they still have 3 designing the phone, and they have 60 people selling their piece of crap, right? And the thing about it is that you can repair it. And it's, in that sense, very green. They are still relying on these smelters in India and China that are exploiting African labor. And it's not even labor, it's slavery, let's put it more bluntly. They're trying to find a way around that. It's obviously not easy when there is a near monopoly in Congo on these materials for CPUs that are needed. This was their release, 27th of August of Smartphone 3. As I say, I'm not trying to get you to buy this. I don't think, part of their problem is I don't think they've even got network suppliers in Asia. They certainly don't in Latin America. They've only got network suppliers in Europe. And then their other thing is, there are more people with PhDs who buy these things. Right? This is the sort of white, educated, I'm about to use a word I hate, woke, middle class. Right? They're all Germans with doctorates. That's not the world. Get real. But they try to bring down their per capita responsibility for emails. So this is the education bit. 10% have PhDs, 44% have at least master's degrees. This is not the working class rising up as one in the cultural studies approved fantasy. But lots and lots and lots of social policy innovations, environmental policy innovations, do not come from the working class. They come from the middle class, right? Whether you're talking about family rights, children's rights, abortion rights, lots of these things are about alliances that involve frequently middle class leaders, because they can speak the language of policy and the law, as well as working class activists. So, it's an interesting thing to think about. They've moved away from either no smartphone or from, say, Android. So clearly they're not your average user. But they're trying to do something different. It's worth thinking about. I'd urge you to ponder it. Yeah?
how is this phone different from what we have that makes it repairable?
Right. So it's very easy to get inside all the parts of it. The parts of it are made and soldered in such a way that you can remove one part and put in another, which is very hard to do in the case of most cell phones. They come with very clear instructions that are not for experts, mavens, and so on. They're for ordinary people.
And the phone looks like this?
It looks like
You
that.
have to carry a backpack.
No, it looks very much like your cell phone does. It's not as sleek and pretty. Because, you know, part of the problem with activism is that you're not allowed to be good looking. Right? You have to dress down. So this is one of the elements. And this is the last slide. This is another kind of activism. Sorry this isn't in English. This is from Argentina, where they love little blonde people, of course. And no offense to little blonde people. What this means is electronic waste is making us sick. Congress people pass the law now, and it lists all sorts of unfortunate mineral sources that are going into the water as a consequence, in this case, of people throwing away batteries. This was a very effective Greenpeace campaign to get Argentina to pass laws requiring the recycling of batteries. Batteries, by the way, are amongst the most dangerous substances in the world. They're still made a lot in the global north. The cancer rates of workers in battery factories are beyond one's ken. So this was a very effective campaign. Greenpeace got hundreds of people to occupy the front steps of the halls of Congress, to sit down on what looked like they were explosive devices that were made of giant fabrications of batteries, you know, wearing bomb disposal outfits to try to make this point. Huge media attention, lots of embarrassment, deputies passing the legislation. So there are lots of cases where activism is having an effect. But the issue for us remains what I put to us at the beginning, the question with which we began. Given the focus not entirely on the smartphone, but largely what I've given you tonight, given the importance that it plays in so many of our lives, including mine, I'm not immune to these things, given the claims made for the smartphone being able to connect us to environmental crises, connect activists and so on, but given also the arguments I've been putting forward about the impact on workers throughout their life cycles, the impact on the climate, the impact on us potentially as users, the impact on recyclers, can they be said to play a positive part in the way that is suggested in that question? So that's it, and let's have more conversation if you would like. Anybody about to not throw their iPhone on improved recycling? Give you a quick story. So the Independent newspaper, which is a liberal paper in the UK, was interested in this question that I was putting up: who picked up your TV from the curb? It's not all your fault. I did not sleep with that woman, Mr. I had my wagging male finger down. So the Independent was interested in what happened to a TV set like your family's, right? And so it took a big TV set and completely gutted it, took everything out, but put in some bricks, taped them down, that weighed the same amount as the ordinary components. And then put in a GPS tracking device to see where it went. So this is from a lower middle class London suburb. It's duly picked up by the municipal authorities. It's taken to a supposedly kosher recycler, and then they track it to Accra in Ghana, to a market where it's being sold as a functioning television set. And it's got bricks and a GPS tracking device. And no one's bothered to see whether it works. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO in the United States, very famously, even though all e-waste export is illegal, placed a dummy advertisement online for, major corporation needs to get rid of electronic waste, had, I think, 70 corporations offering to do the deal within about 5 minutes of placing the ad. So this is a very big issue for us. Yeah.
So, thanks for a really great talk and amazing consciousness raising. I have a question about change, political change, to stab right at the heart of this. The forms of resistance or change you mentioned, I think, kind of, they operate on that kind of imminence with capitalism, regulation, activism, enforcement. But you're talking about something so global, interconnected, complex, that I want to be a bit more reductionist and look at the kind of the driver, the basic driver, which is those kind of political economic things you gestured to. So recalling your declaration, self-proclaimed white socialist, in the end, does it require something much more fundamental and structural?
Oh, sure. As I think does the whole question of environmentalism.
Right.
But I'm not sure that it is just about capitalism, because if you look at the horrors wrought by the USSR, spectacularly, obviously, Chernobyl, but not only. Industrialization is undertaken from an avowedly state socialist system, then the pollution of so much beautiful territory of Russia, of Ukraine, of Georgia, other places is astounding, right? So there's something in there that is about development and growth, right? Of course, those things nowadays are intimately integrated with capitalism, but they were once not so uniquely associated, and they're always associated with the state as well as capital, right? So what does that mean? It means, in thinking about alternatives, you look at people like Arturo Escobar, the Colombian anthropologist, and his ideas of the good life as derived from various forms of indigenous cosmology, and as opposed to the idea of development, and in favor of what he calls, and others too, degrowth. And you can find similar ideas in ecofeminism. These aren't only things that come from Marxism, critiques of capital, although, of course, Escobar and many ecofeminists make those critiques. But you can find them back in the early reaches of Marxism. So one of the great, in many ways, forgotten works is Engels' Dialectics of Nature, right? An astonishing book, where Engels actually says something that Kant gestures at, but people like Hegel completely rejected, which is nature has a history, and we're at a current point in its story, and that story can be ended, can be destroyed. It's all there. He laid it out. He understood. He was a factory owner, the damage, or factory manager for his family. He understood the damage that the world that he was helping to preside over and create was doing. And he explained it in stunning materialist terms. So I guess what I'm saying is, yes, absolutely there needs to be a critique of capitalism, but it's also got to be a critique of development and growth. And that means that those who have, getting back to the point we were talking about earlier, benefited cross-generationally in certain parts of the world from this, do have a real responsibility to those who have not had those benefits and who are being asked to hold back their own desires. Just as they have a special responsibility for countries that I haven't mentioned, say Bangladesh, 110 million people, whose country could easily cease to exist as a consequence of global warming. And that's not to mention micro-states in the Pacific, for instance, that face the same thing. So there has to be some form of a sense, not of guilt, but of responsibility. And I'm not sure that that can be engendered through critique of capitalism, even though I think that's crucial. I think it has to be engendered through a sense of solidarity and connectivity. Do you know what I mean? And so whilst I think what I understand to be your general point is analytically correct, I think the kinds of alliances that are urgently needed are difficult to construct around a critique of capitalism.
And yet I would respond that solidarity, which I totally agree with, would use the word universe, an embrace of a new universe. And maybe, I guess, other people related that to climate, Ulrich Beck or something like that. I see the current political economic system, not merely in its material qualities, but in its cultural, spiritual elements, as totally fragmenting the possibility of the universal as such, including that kind of. So I think what I'm saying is critique of capitalism isn't everything. Maybe we're talking about the same thing. It needs to be alloyed with an affirmation of a universal as well.
Oh, sure, and I think actually that is where these Burkean ideas marry very well with what we might think of as radical ones. And that is the kind of lines you can get. I mean, an interesting example of this, I know, I think you had your hand up.
I just wanted to counter what you said about Engels. But you also said, in a counter to Malthus, that industrialization and science will solve the problem.
Yes, no, that's true. I mean, he was part of this notion which is powerful today. The technology will solve all the problems posed by technology. That is true.
There's a difference between technology and science in that formulation. There's slightly different. Sorry. Yeah.
No, not at all. It's fine. If you look at the ways in which neuroscience and social psychology and media affects people have looked at how to get reactionary people to respond to environmental crisis, as opposed to the way to get liberals to respond to environmental crisis. One can be very critical of this kind of research, but the results are very interesting. The model is that people who are roughly considered progressive, pro-environment, respond to the abstract notion of social justice, of saving the earth, of these as good things, and ends in themselves. People with reactionary politics respond to something visceral that hurts them. They see a picture of a child or an animal suffering. They feel it in their bodies, and that makes them concerned. Now, as I say, one can be critical of this kind of research, but it's very suggestive in terms of acknowledging that one has to have different levels of making the argument for different kinds of audience that will emphasize different things. But yeah.
In that regard of having a different way of speaking about the same exact thing, would there also be a difficulty in general public education? Not that system, but education of, I hate to use the term layman, but it's a summer.
Sure.
In what way then can we, in your opinion, go about spreading knowledge of said topics like this to different types of audience?
Yeah.
How can we do that?
Well, think back to the old German socialist rallying cry of the 19th century, the Long March of the Institutions. And then think forward to the 1960s and the supposed defeat of 68 on idealism in the United States. In fact, it was a victory that's never acknowledged as such. Why was it a victory? Okay, it failed in terms of taking over politics and corporations. It's been spectacularly successful taking over education and libraries. And libraries and educational institutions are, other than some Christian education in the United States, have been very successful at pushing environmental messages, because there are generations of people who are concerned about these questions and are liberal. And that's why there is so much attack in the United States at the moment against Greta Thunberg and her allies, because she is taken as an index and a sign of and it's true, the triumph of environmentalism within public schooling in the United States, in most states, not everywhere, but most. That Long March of Institutions, that was radical women librarians in the 70s, moving into the American Librarians Association and taking it over, and forcing there to be an end to censorship, and forcing there to be discussion of women's issues, adolescent sexuality, and other things available in school libraries. The push towards teaching evolution and also teaching environmental science, incredibly successful. So I think there is, the kernel of something very exciting by following not only the nudging public policy change, doing activism, but taking heart from that 19th century German socialist rallying cry, the Long March of the Institute, or the March of the Institutions, I should say, and the way in which that was implemented in secondary schooling and libraries in the United States at that point of, what many would see as a switching point of failure between the utopianism of that era and the actual capacity to take charge of the political economy. So I do think it's a long-winded way of saying there is an actually existing instance of what you're calling for, and it is in secondary education. And it's amazing to see the views in so many parts of the world of people through adolescence about this topic. The uniformity is amazing. And then, of course, that gets scraped away as they enter the labour force in many instances, but by no means all. Yeah.
I want to ask, do you think that there seem to be two levels at which this might be functioning? And they may, in a sense, clash. So there is the level of the awareness, that the rational argument, the political action, and there is the level of affect and embodiment. So in the sense that there is a sense of desire, right, with the smartphone. There's lots of, that it is an extension of us, right? We are all cyborg, etc. And that there is actual feeling. Like there's so much research about people who talk about their phones as being, so there's a lot of there's projection onto the phone, for example. So, acts of sexting, for example, can lead to that feeling that the phone itself is like an object. So with these two things happening, I'm just trying to conceptualize and maybe ask you how you might think of it, of these two things. And yet, of course, both are connected.
Absolutely.
The greening.
Well, if you think back, again, I'm sorry about all this German romanticism I'm forcing down your throats, but if you think back to German romanticism of the 19th century, the early 19th century, then one of its key binary oppositions is between the beautiful and the sublime, right? You get it earlier in Kant, you get it in Schopenhauer, of course you get it in Burke, I mentioned earlier too, for an Irish idiom. And what these things are opposing is what is often thought of as a masculine versus a feminine quality, for the purposes of various gendered stereotypes. The beautiful is part of nature, it's feminine, it's pliant, it's giving, it's caring, it's pacific, it's gorgeous, right? So that would be a placid blue sea or a gorgeous blue sky would not be there if it had another. Versus the sublime, which is the other side of nature. It's the masculine side, it's awesome, it's powerful, it's dangerous, it's a torrent, it's a storm, it's crackling lightning, that stuff, right? You get this very powerfully not only in philosophy, but in fiction and in art books. Now, what is often used to explain the particular appeal of something like the smartphone is the bringing together of these seeming opposites into what's called the technological sublime. Yes? So what you're told with the release of the newest Samsung or the newest whatever is that, longer lasting battery, better camera, beautiful, sleek design. So you get the masculine computing power with the feminine grace and beauty. Right? This is the great achievement, and that's why in some ways it's right that Apple says it's a design. And that idea of a technological sublime, which I guess, in terms of this idea of bringing together these two elements, contra their binaristic separation in philosophical aesthetics, comes from David Nye, the US historian of technology, in trying, as he did, to explain how it was after the war, that the consumer takeoff that picked up on the stimulus to demand generated by the war hyperinflation, prevented there being a return to the Depression by producing a set of labour-saving devices, so-called, that were also meant to be good-looking, right? That were going to decorate your home and so on. So that capacity is very powerful, and from that comes this cathectic relationship, you know, where people actually think they feel kind of naked if they walk out of their home without their phone. It's like going out without your keys. It's fatal. People don't want to. They rush back. They'll miss a meeting or they have it with them. Some of that is, of course, about its usefulness, its indispensability in certain contexts, but some of it is also about this mixture of its power and its precision and its beauty and its attractiveness, the way in which it becomes part of you. So it seems to me that the way in which some of the things I'm looking for can be made to happen is obviously through public policy reform. So the European Union is about to bring into force legislation that will make it illegal to import materials from conflict mining situations. But it's also about getting people to say, this thing's incredibly important to me. I really, maybe I don't love it, but I have to have it with me. Right? It's how I can talk to my mom, it's how I can apply for a job, it's how I can work out when a bus will come when it's raining. You know, perfectly reasonable things, you know, that are important, can be life-saving in certain instances. But to get people not to see themselves only as consumers or even only as citizens, but as fellow workers. And that life, tracking the life of the commodity sign involves an identification not only with your needs or pleasures or requirements as a consumer of these devices, but how they are part of your working life and how that connects you to people you have never seen or heard of who are manufacturing these devices and who are going to recycle. So it's to take on the Freudian idea of the fetish that has connected you to this thing, to break down the Marxist idea of the fetish, which says you will lose all memory of where this comes from, of all the labour that went into it, that is incarnate as the labour of genius in its presentation, its production, because you will simply see yourself as a consumer, and all that matters is, here it is, I've got my hands on it, I like it, and it works. No, you will think about its prehistory and its future. If that can happen, then you're managing to accept the success of the technological sublime, but you're mobilizing people to amplify their affection and their relationship to this object in order to take account of others on the life spectrum of work associated like them with the life of the commodity side. This is, of course, very easy to do. Yeah.
First, I think I want to thank you for what you presented. It really opened my eyes. As you can see, I'm one of those unwoke pro people with 2 handphones.
I've got 3. This is not a competition.
I mean, but having gone through this,
Yeah.
and I'm aghast at what went into this. And it's interesting that the thing that I picked up was, how does the Fairphone look like, right? And it doesn't look sleek and beautiful, right? But the thing is that message, it's lacking to the... I mean, it's not a coincidence that the Fairphone is largely popular among PhDs. Because they have the access to this knowledge. What is stopping this message from getting out in a more, I don't know, accessible manner to, you know, the unwoke masses? I mean, I was just here to spend time with her, and you know, I'm like.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, there's only one of me on the bench. No, in all seriousness, obviously, there's a banal answer, which is that there are so many interests that are invested in concealing this problem, and there's absolutely no doubt about that. I think that's utterly crucial. And the other thing is that it is a very complex story to tell. So there are some business people at UC Irvine who think they've worked out the entire geographical story of an iPhone. It involves at least 10 countries. It's more complicated than I told you. Finding out the truth about how these things are made and where they're made is more complex than I've made it look. And yet even that part, why would you know? Because it requires putting together different bits of information that are kept separate. So one thing that needs to happen is regulatory requirements to open up the process. So part of that is putting on the front of the label of the toy, this might give you cancer if you're a male rat. And part of it is saying, as Fairphone does, this is where this was made. Here are the people who made it. This is what they want you to know. Instead of all that rubbish packaging that we get, that looks so pretty, it's part of I this and I that. But capitalists don't want to do this. It's a bummer, it's a turn-off. They have to be forced. Now we've seen Apple give in to massive popular pressure over this business of doing at least some audits of Foxconn factories. And it's not only Foxconn, there are other companies too, just Foxconn that do this. They are sensitive when this reaches a critical mass of critique. So I think there was another hand. Yeah.
I'm just going to reference it again, and you can correct me if I'm wrong by way of thinking. Because I'm exchange from California, actually.
Where in California?
Central Valley. So Silicon, like maybe
Sure.
2.5 hours
Sure.
away.
Sure.
So I was thinking more along the lines of, and I've seen interesting connections with other aspects as well, that we are more or less on our daily lives focused with the immediate. The immediate, the pressing, the priority, and that a lot of things that I hear from people that I talk with are, I don't have time. It's not important at this moment to me, etc. And so, like the similar example connection I make it is with food. Like, oftentimes you're like, I want food. Here's food right in front of me. I'm going to eat it. The question as to where that food came from. Not just basically serving it, who's making it, who's growing it, who's distributing it.
I'm a consumer and I want this thing.
Right. Same connection. I'm not certain if I can think of a way to branch it out other than your just innate curiosity of where this comes from. It's a quick little thought.
Well, people don't have much innate curiosity. I mean, look at ourselves, right? I'm glad I have this thing. I'm glad it works. I need it. It's so incredibly powerful. That's why, as I said, it needs to be, and this does get back to a critique of capitalism, because obviously divide and rule is a core concept of capitalism. Trying to get people to go beyond seeing themselves as just consumers and to have fellow feeling with others. Very quick anecdote, to finish, right? So, as some of you know, I've been doing some work with some scholars in Colombia into Masglo. Masglo is one of the biggest nail polish manufacturers, and it's dominant in South America, and it's very popular in the southeast of the United States, and Africa is its next big target. Masglo has 3 demographic groups that it devises nail polish for, so all female. It has pre-teens, who their new target market. It has teen girls, and all the nail polishes are named after boys. So Friday is Juan, Saturday is Andre, etc. And then the adult ones have a vast array of colours and names, many of which are intensely misogynistic. Slut, bossy boots, controlling bitch, titles like this, along with darling and cute heart. Really offensive language. They are hugely popular. So this generated a backlash on the F word and the T word, Facebook and Twitter. So on the F word, people started saying, this is misogynistic, we should boycott this brand, it's terrible. Not much followed on the F word, but lots followed on the T word, with thousands of women, mostly women, a few men, to the extent you can be certain about the identities of people, contributing to a debate about these misogynistic terms for adults. The vast majority of women in favour of them, saying it doesn't matter, lighten up, stop being a feminist Nazi, this sort of language, right? You're familiar with this. Intense anger from the, say, 25% of participants who were deeply offended by being caricatured in these ways by the company. The in-house poet of the company, as he is known, who had run the campaign, thanked all the participants, saying that this was just the kind of conversation about feminism that the company wanted to generate. It was terribly important that as part of its desire to elevate the situation of women and protect them from domestic violence and improve their working lives, that they had succeeded in their main goal. Now, one of the things that troubled us when we looked at the debate was that nobody talked about the women in the factories who make the nail polish varnish, and nobody talked about the women in the salons who apply it, which is a very big issue in Colombia, which is where this company is based, because increasingly the women who apply the varnish in salons are Venezuelan refugees who undercut the price of women from Colombia who are working in salons. The only job you can get pretty much as a Venezuelan refugee woman is a sex worker or in a nail salon. So what we've tried to do is to create another discourse, which is about not being horrified as a customer, though that's not wanting to stop that, but acknowledge that that was sort of lost, right? That 3/4 of people just didn't accept it. But they're all, or most of those women participants, are people who work as well as people who buy. So what about getting them to think about the occupational health and safety hazards of the women in Maslow's factories who make this stuff, and the women who are exposed, because there are some really bad epidemiological consequences of constant exposure to this stuff before it sets, who are in salons 8, 10, 15 hours a day. But if you could create that sort of networked story and consciousness, you would get something more interesting than, I don't care if it calls you this or that. Well, I do. You know, that doesn't really meet minds. People tend not to change. At least that's what we found with our research. But if you look at something that they actually do share, most of, then you might get people who might see themselves as anti-feminist and people who might see themselves as feminists being concerned about other women. So that's I guess, the net story for me, getting back to this life of the commodity sign and getting people to identify universally, to pick up on your term, as workers. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Carissa. Thank you to